Hello, and welcome to this Berkley Center webinar on strategic religious engagement and peace building. Thank you all for joining us today, and a special thanks to our panelists for being a part of this conversation. My name is Melissa Nozell, and I'm a Strategic Religious Engagement Fellow here at the Berkley Center. Today's discussion will focus on tools for strategic religious engagement, how they are being used in practice, what we are learning from that experience, and what it will take to ensure their continued relevance moving forward. In particular, we'll be framing this conversation around a specific tool, the Religion and Peacebuilding Action Guides that were developed by the U.S. Institute of Peace, Salam Institute for Peace and Justice, and the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. This conversation is part of the work of the Strategic Religious Engagement Hub, or SRE Hub, at the Berkley Center. The SRE Hub is an initiative that began about a year ago and is dedicated to supporting U.S. government capacity for engaging religious actors in the contexts of diplomacy, development, and defense. Over the past several decades, this capacity, what we refer to as strategic religious engagement, was developed across the interagency, such as at USAID and the State Department, and by independent institutions like the United States Institute of Peace. At its core, SRE refers to the intentional and informed engagement with religious actors as part of advancing foreign policy and national security objectives. Following institutional changes in the past year, much of this infrastructure has been diminished, and the SRE Hub is working to help preserve and strengthen this capacity by maintaining institutional memory, curating key resources, convening practitioners and experts, and exploring new pathways for engagement. These efforts have been generously supported by the Henry Luce Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Peacebuilder Grant Fund. Today's discussion builds in part on a recent project through the Peacebuilder Grant Fund that examines the continued use and impact of the Religion and Peacebuilding Action Guides for practical tools intended for religious actors and those who engage them in peacebuilding work, including conflict analysis, mediation, reconciliation, and gender-inclusive processes. The development of the guides began in 2014, the same year I began working on USIP's religion program. And over the years, I've been able to observe how the guides have been applied and adapted really taken lives of their own in different contexts around the world. The guides have been used and adapted to train military chaplains and policymakers, religious youth and clerics across traditions, with undergraduate and graduate students. This assessment that we've just undertaken has revealed that in the past year alone, over 2,000 people were trained in the action guides across the globe, including in sub-Saharan Africa, such as Nigeria, Kenya, Cameroon, and Burundi, in South and Southeast Asia, like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, and in Europe, the UK, Switzerland, and in the United States. Our speakers today will highlight some of these engagements and their impacts. The action guides demonstrate how SRE has been operationalized in practice, and they serve as a useful lens for thinking about both lessons learned and future directions. Now, let me briefly introduce our esteemed panelists. Jessica Rowland is the Senior Specialist for Inclusive Peace for the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, where, among her roles, she oversees training programs for youth mediators and women religious leaders. Dr. Scheherazade Jaffery, the author of the Religion and Gender Guide, is an adjunct lecturer in the program on Justice and Peace at Georgetown University, where she teaches courses on religion and conflict and peacebuilding and decolonizing peace and justice. She's also a co-founder and lead consultant for the Ripple Collective. Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimr is founder and president of the Salam Institute for Peace and Justice and a professor of peace and conflict resolution at American University. He's also one of the longstanding partners involved in developing the guides. Salim Charles is a Nairobi-based peacebuilding practitioner and grassroots organizer. He's the executive director of Reimagining New Communities. And Reverend Susan Hayward is the senior SRE fellow at the Berkley Center. And for 14 years, she led USIP's religion program. She's co-editor of the Action Guides series. So we'll start this conversation by looking back at the context in which these tools were developed, then delve into how they're being used today, and we'll finish with more of a future look. And we'll be sure to leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So to those in the audience, please be thinking about the questions you'd like to pose to the panelists, and you can type your question at any point by clicking the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will note that this event is being recorded and it will be available on the Berkley Center website and on YouTube in the coming days. So with that, I'll invite you to launch into the conversation. Let's begin with Susie and Mohammed. You were both involved with the action guides from the very beginning. I'd like to ask you to describe the context in the religion and peace building field when the action guides were developed, when they were conceived of over a decade ago that prompted their development, and how you anticipated them being used and imagine them being rolled out in the early years. Let's start with you, Susie, and then Professor Abu Nimr Mohammed will turn to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be with you. Back in 2014, when I joined USIP in 2007, I had done some work in religion and peace building and in other contexts and organizations and overseas. And we were, at the time, still a fairly small subfield within peace building itself, theory and practice, as well as in the broader U.S. foreign policy, and even smaller little sliver in that. And we were still in the early 2000s trying to make the case for religion matters. And people should have some literacy when it comes to religion as a sociological force, a political and economic force within societies that influence both the dynamics of violence and the dynamics of peace building. And by the time 2014 came around, there was a great deal more acknowledgement and support for this idea that, religion matters. We need to be thinking about that. But the question had increasingly become, okay, so how do we engage with religious actors? How do we consider religion in a sensitive and careful way as peace building practitioners before we even begin to engage within the religious landscape? What do we need to know about religion? This was also at a time when within the U.S. foreign policy landscape, there was a great deal of energy and activity in building up kind of institutional capacities and infrastructures in support of religious literacy and religious engagement in peace building, human rights development, and so on. So in 2013, there had been the passage in the National Security Council of the Engaging Faith Leaders in overseas national security efforts. That, coming out of the White House, had really spurred a lot of activity across different agencies and bureaus and offices that work in foreign policy, including those that work in peace building efforts. And at the State Department in 2013, you had the creation of the Religion and Global Affairs Office. So it was being built up at this time. So I think that was also spurring the support for the development of these kinds of tools that foreign service officers and peace building practitioners, both those in religiously defined spaces and organizations, and those in secular oriented organizations and actors could use. Now that they were increasingly interested in, curious about, and willing to engage within the religious landscape in these spaces. So we sought then to develop these kinds of tools, drawing on, and I hope that my colleague Mohammed will speak about this a bit. There was also at the time a good deal of work that was being done in the peace building work to evaluate what worked and what didn't in this very nascent kind of subfield of religious peace building. So both the sort of institutional space that we were at in Washington, D.C., with this greater appetite for, and spaces in which these tools could be used across the whole landscape of U.S. foreign policy, and the sort of cultural moment of this turn towards interest in cultural and religious dynamics within peace building and U.S. foreign policy turned us toward that. And at USIP, we'd had the religion program that was created in 1989 and had been this long drumbeat in Washington, D.C. and in the global peace building world to think about religion in a really careful, nuanced, and systematic way, and to engage with religious actors and organizations in peace building. So it made a certain amount of sense that that the USIP's religion program would serve as the convener of a number of different actors and organizations, including the Salam Institute and the Network for Religion, the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, and others in support of that work. Mohammed, what am I missing?
I think usually comprehensive, but I think it's um, well, thank you all, Melissa, and also it's good to be with you all again. Good to see you and be in this platform. I guess I'll continue with where Susan from where Susan started, 2007, and I think maybe my age is want me to go back to the 1989 or 1990s. And I think I'd like to characterize the engagement and the treatment of the concept of faith and religion in peace building as sort of, and I've written about this a piece at least in the past, that we are moving typically from the denial to the defense stage, and then, moving to the compartmentalization, and then ending with integration and mainstreaming. Similar processes for race relation and gender relation when they were banging on the doors of development agencies and also in the academics. So I think, by the 90s, early 90s, when the Soviet Union was collapsed and there is a flourishing of civil society agency working, the peace building field really picked up and began working and more legitimate. And this field, as we all know, is based on the assumption of neoliberalism, which is, very fairly secular field. So, if we talk about religion in the early 90s, we talk about I remember in the USIP, we hosted the fundamentalism project with Scott Appleby, and also some other initiative were taking place in the UK about religion and development. But these were all events in the first 15 years, where we're trying to convince the people that religion do exist and religious peace building do exist. But even in the larger concept that religion do exist, and during that time also, we developed a toolkit for the CMM, conflict management and mitigation group, 101 we used to call it, and 102, how to train US diplomats in considering religion at all, meaning moving it from the denial stage to the defense stage. Denial that it doesn't exist, but the once they discover it exists, then they say, but is it effective? How does it work? And all of these questions. Once we pass this stage, second stage of defensiveness, where they will say, look, yes, I know religion important and it matters and it does exist, and I don't know, if it's effective. But then once we convince them it is effective, they said, okay, how do we do it? How do we try it out? And that's a usually third stage. And many organizations did compartmentalization with that. Susan gave a very good example of the seventh floor State Department, which I think the highest religion made it into governance. So I was, flourishing time, and I think one of the largest operation globally, where the government allocated resources, staffing, and very close to the foreign ministry office. I think that was the closest. Still, but though it was compartmentalized in one section, if you go to the AU, you'll find one person or two in one room who deal with the religion, and they usually send you to that person. Similarly, as I said, happened also in gender. And I think the idea of the toolkit emerged exactly in that period of time of 2010, 2011, 12, and then 14 maybe came to fruition. But it was the idea at Salam Institute. We were doing a training in interfaith peace building in Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Pakistan, and also the Arab region. And there was lots of demands on that. And the European Union, United States, department, and different groups really began looking at, okay, how do we do this? Now we convince it's matter, it's relevant, and we want to do it. But how do we do it? So it's kind of you sold the product to somebody and they find it in their house and they don't know how to use it. So we thought, okay, those are there three entities at least where the gaps exist. One is the peace building field itself. And I'm sorry to say that this is a fairly secular neoliberal field that is mainly looking from a universally human rights perspective. And we all assume that if they do their work correctly, they will relate to peace and culture. And we discover no, they basically will continue to operate from their secular perspective. So that was one of the main target practitioners and experts of peace building. A second group is really development and governmental agency. Um, they wanted to do the work, like CARE, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, DFID, UNDP, many of these agencies wanted at some point, and they had the peace building to as a check mark in their part, and we wanted to offer them that. So we wanted also to train diplomats and development working in that importance. The third one is really the target. Maybe I'm sure my colleague will talk about that later. Academic peace building program. That's the factory where we produce a new peace builder, academic and professional. And that factory itself is an academe, and academe is very anti-religion, anti-faith. So that also was a good target to bring the toolkit into conflict resolution courses, peace building universities, and mastery program. And I think that third phase was the context where this developed. Maybe just, and I think that's where we, up to 2017, when the new administration came in and the office from the seventh floor was abolished. And unfortunately, we are even in a more regrettable position now, where even the entire USIP was closed, and we although I said denial, defense, and then compartmentalization, and then integration, it seemed linear. And I think what has happened now, that we regressed back, and now we're back into the stage of defense. The whole field, not only religion and peace, interreligious peace building, but the whole field of peace building is struggling in finding its space and relevancy in an age of weaponization, militarization, populism, and exclusion. And I think an attack on it's the foundation of the field of religion and peace. And our foundation is really one in all this field, in my view. It's the religious diversity, cultural and religious diversity. That's what we promote, that's what we advocated for. And right now, what we see in Europe, in the US, and also in global South, certain areas, there is a huge attack and the threat on the similar or on the mere foundation of this. And even we're seeing a huge surge among politicians and certain religious figures, in using religion to justify genocide in Gaza, justify attacks in Lebanon, to justify the war in Ukraine, to justify the war in Sudan. We've seen religion being thrown into the midst, exactly the opposite of what we have been advocating for the past 4 decades. And it's unfortunate, but my message here, realizing that we are in the midst of this challenge now, that we don't give up. Those toolkits become even more relevant and more important, and the whole emphasis on religious diversity and the pluralism and inclusion becomes even more essential for our field of peace building in general. And as Susan said, in the subfield of interreligious peace building become one of the very few tools where we can gain entry in many societies, where the belief and the credibility of diplomacy, of peace building, have been damaged greatly and deteriorated in many parts of the world. So maybe those toolkits can be regenerated in a way that can be utilized as an entry point to say, we all suffering from this new reality that we found ourselves in. And instead of being in a mainstreaming position, meaning all government agency, all development agency using relating to religion as an integral part of their work, we're finding back now in 2026 in the relevancy of peace, relevancy of peace building, relevancy of diplomacy, relevancy of multilateralism and the relevancy of religion and peace. And I think that's important to continue and push this, push this not agenda, but I guess this discourse and this set of values. And I'll stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Mohammed and Susie. It was a really helpful overview, both in terms of the context in which the action guides were developed, but also the overall arc of the religion and peace building field. And I think, Mohammed, you bring us to today very eloquently and the need for tools like these action guides. So that segues nicely, I think, into the next question that I'll pose to Jessica, Salim, and Scheherazade, starting with Jessica. And Jessica, the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers is the third partner and key partner in the Action Guide series and their development, and has been particularly proactive in the dissemination of the Action Guides, including through the trainings that you've been leading. I'm wondering if you can share a bit more about those trainings and give some context to how the guides are being applied today. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for having us all here. So the Peacemakers Network, we've been using the guides across a range of our programs since the beginning. This includes our religion and mediation courses that we do with UN officials and religious leaders, our engagement with traditional and insider faith-oriented mediators, and our new dedicated women and faith-based mediation programs. We've applied these guides in both online and in-person settings, adapting them to very different audiences and contexts and levels of experience. And we've worked with a range of our network members, including a USIP, of course, with you, Melissa. You helped to found our youth faith-based mediation program, ETH Zurich, Rose Castle Foundation, and Mediators Beyond Borders International. So these programs, I know even with the program we do with ETH, there's been over 300 mediators trained, and even with our other women and youth programs, I know we're well over 200 in the last 3-4 years. So this group is only growing, which is great. But what we have found most effective is not just using the guides in isolation, but embedding them in broader capacity strengthening processes. So, for example, the Religion and Mediation Guide provides a strong foundation for understanding how to design and implement mediation processes that meaningfully engage religious actors. When we complement this with additional methodologies such as trust building approaches developed to ensure inclusive participation and scenario-based role plays that allow participants to practice applying the tools in realistic contexts, this actually gives a really like the teeth to the guides, as we would say. A key priority for us really is on strengthening the capacities of women and young people as mediators and peace builders. We see these groups not only as beneficiaries, but as essential actors who are unrecognized in these formal peace processes. And these guides offer a structured entry point. But we try to adapt them, of course, to reflect the lived realities. So whether that's navigating local power dynamics, addressing resistance from community leaders, or even in today's context, really addressing one's own self-care to really be able to go, as we know, these peace mediation processes are long. In terms of reception, the content has been very well received, particularly because it's very practical and adaptable. We appreciate that it doesn't prescribe this single model, but really offers these flexible frameworks that can be tailored to different contexts. So in many cases, the mediators who have been trained have gone on to use the tools within their own communities, training others, facilitating dialogues, and integrating their own elements into their ongoing peace initiatives. But ultimately, our goal here is not to build individual capacity, but really to create a ripple effect. So equipping participants with the knowledge, competence, and tools to localize and sustain peace efforts in their own networks and communities.
Thank you, Jessica. And that ripple effect, I think, was so apparent in the assessment that I conducted over the past couple months, where I heard from many of, in particular, the youth leaders who were trained through this program, who have been applying the action guides and what they learned through these trainings into their communities in context across the globe and adapting them. And we're so pleased that Salim has been able to join us. Salim was trained through this program and has in fact been taking the action guides and adapting them into various contexts within Kenya. So Salim, I'll turn to you to talk a little bit more about your work.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for inviting me. My name is Salim Charles, and I'm glad that I'm part of that ripple effect from what Jessica just mentioned. And for me, I don't take it as a privilege, but as a responsibility given to me by my organization and the community that I work with and the churches in Kenya to be able to get this knowledge. And as Jessica mentioned, that it's not about supporting individuals, but providing that opportunity where individuals can be able to learn and be able to shape the organizations and the communities that they work in. And so I come from Kenya. I was born and raised in Kenya, and my work is based in Kenya and work with grassroots organizations. And one of the things that you might be knowing is that religion in Kenya remains the most trusted and accessible community spaces. And in many communities, when conflict emerges, before people turn to governments or even external support, they first turn to religious leaders and women ministry leaders and local congregation. And so that's why for us, strategic religious engagement in peace building is not an option, but it's very essential. And so through our organization, Reimagine New Communities, we have been applying these action guides through our Faith for Peace program since 2024. I got trained in 2023. And so from 2024, we started applying these action guides, and we have used them in a number of engagements, from youth leaders mediation workshops, to women ministry mediation workshop, to pastors orientation meetings. And one thing that we have been able to see out of what has made these guides especially useful is that they are practical and context sensitive, and directly connect to the issues that the partners, our grassroots partners, were facing or navigating. For example, in one of the workshops that we held, our very first youth mediation workshop, where we used the guides to strengthen self-awareness, introduce key mediation concepts, and also help young leaders understand the role of religion in conflict resolution. The participants, and we gathered a number of participants from across around 10 religious institutions. So the participants explored how conflict can emerge within their ministry spaces, through understanding, communication, and even, exclusion and breakdowns, and leadership tension. And that came out so openly, and how they can be able to respond constructively. And so many young people appreciated having that structured, tools to conflict analysis. And I saw, like it was the first time they were engaging in this kind of dialogue, in this kind of engagement. And they learned, just from the action guides about dialogue facilitation and what they could do immediately within their ministries, and their church communities. We also saw similar values, and we have seen that through our engagement with the women ministry leaders. Many women, as we all know, are already doing daily peace building work, and that starts from their families to their, in Kenya we have small women groups called chamas, and even to the congregations. And often they are quiet and without formal recognition. And so what the guide have helped us with this women leaders, is to strengthen their confidence and practical skills in terms of listening, mediation, and reconciliation. And also, like affirming the leadership role they already play, because one of our work is grounded in lived experiences, and also appreciating that we know the people that we are working with in the community, they already have those experiences. And so every tool that we bring is to strengthen already whatever they know. With pastors, who are our main targets, and other senior religious leaders, grassroots leaders, the guides have created space to reflect on how moral authority can be matched with practical peace building tools. And we have seen, for us, we have conducted a lot of listening sessions with them, and we see, how religious leaders carry trust and influence. But that influence is combined stronger when they actually understand mediation and conflict analysis skills. When they have the right skills, then they are able to leverage on the influence that they have. And so when they are better equipped to prevent tension before they escalate, and we have seen from over 30 religious institutions that we have worked with, a reduction of tension within and out without the congregation and their churches. And so one key reflection that we carry since we have started working using the action guide is that effective strategic religious engagement happens when all these global frameworks become usable at the grassroots. Because we are a grassroots organization, and so communities do not need abstract language. They need practical tools that they can trust, adopt, and also use. And that's what we have seen and found as valuable in the action guides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salim. And I think that's particularly insightful and valuable feedback as well, that tools like these particular action guides can be adapted and really localized. And it speaks to the work that you and your colleagues have been doing, that you've been able to do that in such a way that's helped and built upon what already exists in the community. I'll turn now to Scheherazade, and Scheherazade, I'll invite you to share a bit about how you've been using the action guides in your classes at Georgetown and otherwise, and also speaking from the perspective as an author of the gender guide. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So happy to be with you all. So I've used the action guides in different ways with diverse groups as a trainer and facilitator, but I'll focus more specifically now on how I've been using the guides within the last 2 years, in particular within a classroom setting with undergraduate students. And when we were writing these guides, we were very clear that we did not want these to be highly theoretical. We did not want to treat these as scholarly texts. As you were just saying, Salim, we wanted them to be actually useful for folks, right, working at the community level. So I was curious to see how is this going to work in a classroom with students who at this stage in their life, most of them are not really engaged in that practice yet, right? Hopefully in the future as future peace builders, as future policymakers, but not at this stage. And I found that actually this series, these guides as tools, were really helpful in complementing and grounding the theoretical and scholarly work that they were studying. And so specifically in the class, I had them read all or parts of all of the guides throughout the semester, and then for their final project, they wrote a case study on a contemporary conflict situation in which some dimension of religion was either being used to fuel the conflict and or could potentially support peace building and justice work. And I wanted them to actually apply the steps of the guide in their analysis and in thinking about what peace building within this context could look like. So I just want to share a couple observations from how that all worked with them. So one thing I noticed right away is that the guides were really helpful in encouraging the students to be a lot more nuanced, more contextual, more precise in their analysis. So just as one example, all of the guides, we defined religion along these 5 dimensions. So not just religion as, a set of beliefs or kind of as like a general, right, large entity, but rather as a set of ideas, a community, institution, symbols and practices, as spirituality. So along these different dimensions. And so we drew that framework and other tools like that other ways of understanding religion. We use that throughout the semester. And so what that helped the students do is to really go beyond just saying, oh, that's a religious conflict, right? Or looking at a news headline about religion, and begin to ask some critical questions about what are we actually seeing here, right? Like, what is the role of religion? What is the understanding the meaning of religion in people's lives within a particular context, within a particular time, and recognizing that that can change. So it really, I think all the guides are very good, I think, in encouraging folks to ask questions, to be curious, to be open, to let go of assumptions that they might have. And so when it came to the students' final case studies, it was actually really interesting to see the range of contexts in which they applied these guides. So as a class on religion and conflict and peace building, I always get students, of course, who focus on Israel, Palestine, or on Myanmar, on Northern Ireland, et cetera. And those were great papers. They were very strong. But I want to actually mention a couple others that were different and were unique in what I've seen in previous years. And I think it has to do with the use of the guides. So for instance, a couple students looked at the role of local religious actors in response to the presence of ICE and the National Guard within their own communities in the US. A couple students looked at how religious communities are pushing back against rising white Christian nationalism and kind of the embedded misogyny within these movements. Again, looking at the role of religious actors and pushing back against that. One student looked at different religious approaches to trans rights. Another looked at rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on college campuses post-October 7, including their own campus, including at Georgetown. And so many students focused on issues and contexts in which they had some connection. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that across the guides, all of the guides really emphasize and actually start with the importance of self-reflection. Self-reflection is the first step. Asking questions like, who are you in relation to the conflict, the community, right, in which you're either working or in their case, interested in studying? What do you know about this context or this religious community? What are your pre-existing assumptions? How might your identity, whether your religious identity or gender identity, how might that impact the way that you're perceived by potential partners or others within a particular community, other actors? And this is not something that students were used to doing before writing a research paper. Some students wanted to skip over it. They were more comfortable with kind of that third person, supposedly objective, but of course we know not objective, right, stance on looking at a conflict that's far away. And I think, so we had a lot of really good conversation about how we're never really separate from these issues that we're studying. And the more we can be thoughtful and curious and open, the stronger our analysis, the more effective, likely, our peace building interventions can be. So overall, it's been a positive experience working in the classroom.
Thank you, Shahrazad, for sharing that. And it's really interesting to hear the many ways that the action guides are being thought of and applied by your students and indeed around the world. I'll remind the audience that we'll have an opportunity to answer questions in Q&A in a few moments. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please note them in the Q&A chat box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can. If you have a particular question for a specific panelist, please indicate who the question is directed to as well. So we'll close this portion of the conversation with a look at the future. And I think we've already begun that conversation a little bit. We find ourselves, as Mohammed, you alluded to, in this particular moment in time in 2026 when so much is happening in the world, in our communities, and the guides are as relevant as ever. Religion is as relevant as ever. And this is an opportunity that we have these action guides, and maybe they can continue to evolve with the times in which we find ourselves. And I'm curious and would invite each of you to respond in about 2 to 3 minutes with just generally, how do you think the guides, these action guides can, and perhaps other tools that you may be aware of, can continue to be relevant to support the positive role of religion in addressing peace and conflict dynamics in the world. Let's start with Mohammed. You unmuted first. Go ahead.
Thank you. I've been in my mind. Thank you. And thank you, Shahrazad, and as well as Jessica and Salim for the concrete example. I've had similar experience with the classes as Shahrazad described. I used the reconciliation component in my class and one on dialogue. But I'll give a hint, I'll give a sort of anecdotal example. Yesterday, I had a discussion over dinner with somebody I know for about 20 years or so from the Middle East, and he was trying to convince me yesterday that Iran and Israel, Palestine, Gaza, and Lebanon, and even Sudan are all religious conflict. And now we are into the phase, he called it in Arabic, aqidah, sort of about the faith. And that's exactly where we don't want people to be thinking that the wars are about religion and about theology. And he was giving me examples, and this is somebody with a PhD in a related field. And I said, look, I mean, this is exactly what we work against. These wars are not necessarily about religion and faith. These wars has many other elements. And I was thinking about the panel today that, conflict analysis without understanding the role of religion and just will help really without understanding, it will add more and more people thinking that this is either us or them mentality, either our faith or their faith. And we know this type of thinking will basically lead to further violence and further divisions and lack of ability to connect and reach to the other. So in today, I think we have even more importance for using these type of tools to help people understand that the use of the violence and the militarization and the wars, whether it's with Iran or Hezbollah or with Hamas or in Gaza context, or even in Sudan, many of these have economic, have political, have hegemonic power agendas in the region, regional interests. And the theology of it is really one element that's been manipulated, thrown into the mix, rather than the fight is over this. And also, one more point I want to say about the future, and I've seen this in the past 4 years, we have a major issue with the complacency of religious actors and agencies regarding the war and the militarization. To see a group of religious leaders, Christian in this particular, placing their hands on the shoulder of a leader, in the Oval Office when they are launching a war against somebody, whether it's Iran or any other, is the pure misuse of religion, is a pure manipulation of the religious identity. And unfortunately, throughout those 3-4 years, we haven't seen enough interfaith and interreligious agency standing and confronting, connecting our work to the social movements, to the political movements, to the solidarity movements. Kind of, many of the interfaith dialogue groups saying, keep low profile now until this period passes, keep low profile, don't make your very clear against these policies. And I think that is one of the biggest damage to the field of interreligious peace building. It basically, people will ask us, where you were during this war, why you didn't do whatever you can to convey the message that the war in Iran, the war in Sudan, the war in everywhere, in the name of religion, is a big danger for our society. And I think that's where the voices of our religious leader, our religious agency, and our interreligious peace building should be really focused. And hopefully, the toolkit can be used as an entry point to trigger these type of conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to Jessica.
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. So first, I think is the adaptation to digital spaces. So we're already seeing that many conflicts and opportunities for mediation are increasingly taking place online. So this creates this space to be able to adapt the guides to support the online and hybrid peace processes, whether it's facilitating dialogue across distances because we know the field costs are skyrocketing, engaging diasporas, creating more safe and accessible entry points for participants who may not be able to engage in person. So the core principles of the guides remain highly relevant, but the modalities of how we apply them are shifting. We also see that the pros and cons of AI, but they can be supportive. And Professor Abu Nimer just mentioned the importance of conflict analysis. So how we integrate AI as a supportive tool, helping to analyze these conflict dynamics at scale and identify these narratives or tensions in online spaces. So there's only good considerations to think about how to support AI. But there are things to consider. Religion and identity is deeply relational and trust-based, so AI shouldn't replace the human facilitation of these processes, but really just support it. The other area I would say is thinking about putting my inclusion hat on. How do we deepen the intersectional approach with these guides? So, for example, we're looking to deepen our work with persons with disabilities. So how are we making these guides more accessible? Also, in thinking now that 80% of armed conflicts are occurring in biodiverse rich regions. So where indigenous peoples live. We have the Indigenous Forum actually happening right now at the UN with actually something started by USIP. There's the Indigenous Peacebuilding Mediation group that's meeting this weekend. So how are we engaging new actors who are being impacted by these conflicts that are only growing? So those would be the two pieces that come to mind.
Thanks, Jessica. Salim.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. So I see a significant opportunity for these guides to continue shaping religious engagement, especially as Jessica has said, we are seeing a lot of declining trust in institutions. There is that increase in decline of trust, displacement, but also tension. But I see an opportunity where these guides can be able to offer practical and ethical abilities for conflict analysis and also dialogue facilitation. And I speak for grassroots because I work in the grassroots, and I feel like future priorities should include targeted training for frontline faith leaders or actors, such as pastors, that the ones we work with, who might not have access to, the global opportunities. And so being able to, have these guides translated into local languages will be very helpful. But also with very practical case studies, so that, if it's something, it's a discussion happening in a place like, Kenya, in the grassroots, or in Nigeria, there is a case study that is very relevant, to the people who are using it. So I see this as an opportunity to be able to, have it, that kind of ownership at the grassroots level. I also see it very an opportunity, especially in context affected by social divisions. There is that potential to integrate some modules into existing also leadership trainings, and mentorship programs, and women faith mediators who are working at the grassroots, and also just being able to have TOTs that can be able to cascade these guides and these tools into the grassroots. So those are some of the things that I see. But again, being able to be embedded in the local networks, being able to embed in local networks, peace building practices, where every day people are able to, interact and understand how to use and engage with the tools. Yeah.
Thank you, Salim. A lot of great recommendations to unpack there. Scheherazade.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking about young folks, students in my class, and about the world that they're entering, right, at post graduation, one that's volatile, as rapidly changing dynamics, complex, and so how are we preparing them for operating in that space? And so I think I'd love to see these guides and tools like them, these kind of more applied tools, being used more and more in classrooms alongside our theoretical and scholarly texts, to kind of see them as complementary to each other. I think one of the best things we can do is support young folks in building their capacity for resilience, and also creativity and self-reflection, and open to possibilities, and being able to learn from each other. Connected to that, I think I would love to see more ways to hear how these guides and other tools like them are being used and adapted across different contexts. It's so interesting, Salim, to hear about what does and doesn't resonate, right, within the communities in which you're working. And I think there's so much we can learn about that. Or as you were saying, Jessica, like we're at other intersections as well. So I think having more spaces for conversation like this and other venues as well, just to be able to learn about how these tools are being used, are being adapted within different spaces, I think is really helpful.
Thank you. Susie.
I want to echo Mohammed's concern about the return of a sort of essentialist and non critical narrative about religion and understanding of religion that we're seeing in policy spaces in the US and beyond in this moment. At the time, as we talked about, at the time when these guides were created, it was a very different moment in the US government, where there was a desire to really bring in that more nuanced, the strategic religious engagement was not just about how do we think about religion instrumentally in order to advance US foreign policy goals, but it was also about a sort of ethical approach to religion that took into account the way in which the sort of European context in which the field of international law and diplomacy arose had particular understandings of religion that were often essentialist and were often pejorative. And so it was really seeking to bring a more critical and nuanced understanding of religion in order to advance human rights, appreciation for multi-religious understandings of and approaches to justice and to peace. And now what we're seeing is the return of a far more essentializing sui generis understanding of religion that, if anything, is undermining that kind of an approach of human rights and advancement of democracy. And so my hope is that in the future, these guides can continue to be helpful in, that was sort of a top-down time of approaching a more strategic or inclusive approach to thinking about religion and peace building. Now we're going to need more of the bottom up, really empowering the grassroots to push back against those kinds of essentializing narratives and the use of religion in order to advance economic interests and political interests that are often at the expense of the well-being of much of the people and the planet around the world. And so my hope is that these guides can be put in the hands of people, as Scheherazade was saying, the students today, to the folks who are engaged in forms of resistance and forms of democratic protection within this country and overseas, who are trying to push back against these forces and these power interests that are harming the planet and harming humanity.
Thank you, Susie. And I think you responded very thoughtfully to some of the concerns that were raised in the question from Dr. Azza Karam regarding how, in fact, it's important to be critical of this trajectory, this field as well, when we're looking back on what's worked and what hasn't, and to use the term that our colleague Dr. Peter Mandeville will use sometimes, to right size religion and to help others do the same, and to understand, as part of that exercise of religious literacy, to understand where religion does and does not fit in, and where it's helpful to be engaging with religious stakeholders, and where, in fact, it's not. So we have just a few minutes left. Thank you for the questions that have been coming in. I'd like to point out that a couple folks have asked where you can find the action guides, which is an important question when we've been talking about these guides. Where can you access them? There are a couple places that I'll direct you to. There are links in that question I had answered in typed form. I think it pops up in the answered section of your Q&A. But I'll note orally as well that they're available through the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers website. If you search for action guides and the network, that should come up. It's on their training page. And most of the guides are also linked through the event webpage on the Berkley Center for today's event, and they should all be accessible there shortly. So I'd invite you to take a look at the guides themselves and would welcome feedback through the Berkley Center. You can contact me that way, and I'm always interested to engage more folks with these action guides and would welcome an expansion of this conversation. And I think that that's one of the key themes that I drew on from the reflection on kind of the forward-looking aspect is that expansion of the conversation, of the applicability of that critical thinking around the action guides and religious peace building tools like them. And it's an opportunity to expand the conversation, to think about who's involved, to contextualize them, and to maybe adapt and build them out, and that they may still be quite relevant, and it's important to be intentional about how they can be relevant in which context, and to expand what I've observed to be a real community of practice around these religious peace building tools that have sort of evolved organically. Given that we have only a couple minutes left, I will lift up one of the questions, the first question here, and invite that to be an opportunity for the panelists to give some concluding thoughts. And that is the question from Yusuf Ismail, who writes from Somalia and is asking about strategies and collaborations that can strengthen engagement of religious leaders and civil society actors working on inclusion and social cohesion when it comes to peace building and conflict resolution. And I think it's a broad question, and I'll invite the panelists to think about that question vis-a-vis the toolkits that exist, like the action guides in the religious peace building space, and to think about that question of strategies, collaboration, and real engagement in this field from where you sit. And I'll start with Professor Abu Nimr Mohammed, because you're muted again. I'll start with you again.
I'll learn to mute it then in the future. I guess the question about the use for social cohesion and for engagement is I'm not sure if it's very different from peace building in general. But I think in the context of Somalia or the context of Global South, it's clear to me that peace building, community-based peace building, will not travel very far without serious engagement of the religious actors or religious agency on the ground, whether it's imam, priest, or pastor in this area, or a Hindu priest or rabbi or any other. I think they are the key to both teach and role model. And I think our problem has been more than teaching. Our problem has been in the role modeling part. Our challenge has been in a community level and also globally in many ways to have the religious leaders figure, men, women, and from all ages as well, who will step to the front and feel protected and supported by their community to take a very different stand against violence. So I think to combine specific activities and the training and capacity building for religious agency actors on the ground who are hesitant in order to work with them in how they can take the steps toward more social cohesion. And I think development is the great space to do that. I don't think it should be only exclusively on peace building. I think it should combine issues of development, more incorporation of interreligious peace building, but through development. I found that to be far more effective and far more engaging, and there are many more incentive for religious leaders to pick up the concept of dialogue and peace and social cohesion if it's done under the umbrella of economic social development. And I think that also gives them support and protection against why they're doing that in their own community. I'll stop with that one.
Thank you, Mohammed. Jessica.
Yeah, I was reflecting on that question, but also I know there's some chatter in Daaz's question about religious literacy, and this is kind of combining both. Something that we do in the courses with the guides is, I mentioned, okay, you can design and implement these peace processes, but how do you build trust to get the parties to the table to begin with? And through Rose Castle's contextual theology program that they do, it's actually building a table for people to come and actually listen to the sacred texts of different faiths and having discussions about it. So it's integrating religious literacy into the broader kind of program. You also see this too, at the global level of how some of these regressive narratives are dominating the peace building and larger equality, like thinking about the Commission on the Status of Women and gender equality, these larger spaces of these louder voices dominating some of these conversations. And so something that we've also been thinking and how do we address this is how do we, when we're working with women and youth, they may not feel as confident as some of the religious leaders, usually older men, to actually push for some of these sacred texts as arguments of being able to push back against the pushback. So, for example, we're working as part of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council and the Gender Working Group to draft a compendium that's being currently validated that promotes positive faith-based narratives in promoting gender equality. So these are just examples of how we're trying to intersect the two to be able to make people feel empowered that they can go and actually use the texts themselves.
Thanks, Jessica. Salim?
To echo what Jessica have said, and I think so. I was thinking about trust building, but also I feel what is important is where faith actors and the civil society jointly come together for dialogue. And coordinating responses. And I think what will also be important is where the co-design programs on mediation, youth engagement, and also issues that are within the context where they're working, and like what you have been saying, and I just want to reiterate that even when they are co-designing these programs, it's important to also ensure that they include marginalized groups, in this collaboration, so that this engagement is not just limited to, the senior leadership, but also to everyone, persons with disability, children, and everybody that is involved in the work that they're doing. But again, ultimately, I think the most effective partnership and collaboration, as Jessica said, should be built on trust and shared values, and also clear roles on what is supposed to be done in terms of commitment to serving their communities, other than just competing for visibility, but complementing each other. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Scheherazade?
Yes, thank you. So I'm also thinking about how to be engaging not just those in official religious leadership positions, but others as well, grassroots folks and others who might not be carrying that title specifically, but are nevertheless religious actors and very influential within the spheres of work that they are engaged in. And I think one of the things that the guides do is help to think about what are the types of questions, what are the factors to be thinking about to support different groups of people. So in supporting women, for instance, or for youth, the things to be considering are different than someone else. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And Susie?
Over time, so I'm just going to make this really quick. Echo what everybody said. Also want to note that depending if you're looking at this from the ground up again or from the top down. There's going to be different questions with respect to social cohesion when it comes to religious identity and structural discrimination than there is going to be for the faith actors on the ground and the questions of theology and how they relate to other religious traditions and so on, and other races and other genders.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, the panelists, for joining this conversation, for your really thoughtful reflections. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. Thanks to those who were able to hang on these extra few minutes and really appreciated the thoughtful questions as well. We welcome the chance to stay engaged in this conversation and look forward to seeing you all hopefully at future events. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the team at the Berkley Center who have been instrumental in helping us to host today. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your days.